Ford, Brown Brothers new car values you won't want to miss. Our prices, our quality, our selection, our Brown Brothers reputation make us your choice number one. It's the deal you make. You make your own deal, then you know the price is right. Now, great new car buys at Make Your Own Deal prices. 42nd and West Boulevard. At Brown Brothers, we put our seal on your good deal.
BCTV, we're giving it all we got.
Good morning. What can the federal NDP do to help poor Davy Barrett and his tired minions in Victoria as a social credit steamroller pounds over them, presumably act after act after act after act, because the federal NDP's got its own troubles. One of the troubles is not the man in my studio. At least I'm told he's not. He's the universally acclaimed forever leader of the NDP, and his name is Ed Broadbent. So we'll tackle Ed on national and some provincial matters. But also this morning we have a Liberal Party senator who's been making some very strange statements recently. And I wonder how it feels to be a senator in the twilight zone. You know who I mean?
When we're running as low as we are in the polls, we need a shuffle in the advisors surrounding the Prime Minister. We need a shuffle in the party organization. We needed a cabinet shuffle. I think it should have been bigger and involved more people than it did. And I think that we have to look at our policy base again, or we're going to have a difficult time winning the next election.
That, of course, is Senator Ray Perrault. But first, the NDP, wherever it stands, with Ed Broadbent after the break. It would be no exaggeration to say to Mr. Broadbent, the national leader of the NDP, that many people are baffled by what's going on in the BC House. And I'm not talking politics just for this particular moment. The other day when Barrett was unable to produce 4 sleeping members for a key vote, one of the government, Pat McGeer, got up and said, I move the question now be put, wham, bam, closure, over and done with. Is that the way you apply closure in the federal House?
No, first, of course, we don't apply it. Those bad Liberals do. But when they apply it in the federal House,
how is closure applied in the federal House?
They have to give 24 hours notice, so you know it's coming ahead. And then there is, I forget, a 3 or 4 hour debate on the motion to move closure itself before it goes into effect. So there's some good time delay before they're announcing their intention to use closure in its actual application.
Is that a normal parliamentary rules of order, or does each House under our system lay down its own rules for the application of the guillotine for the end of a debate?
Each House has its own rules.
And the federal rule is 24 hours notice in advance?
And then a number of hours, whatever it is, debating time on the motion before you actually apply it.
Do you have full freedom, therefore, apart from that closure principle, to filibuster as long as you wish in the House of Commons?
Oh, absolutely.
When did you last filibuster?
The last filibuster, the last prolonged debate, I mean, the opposition, of course, never says they filibuster. We're fighting the Crow legislation as a current example right now. The government, at a certain point, might decide that the opposition's gone on long enough, and they might try to bring in closure.
Do they speak to the whips, first of all? Is there any cooperation in a time of crisis
Absolutely
like
not.
that?
No, when the application of closure, both in Ottawa and in Victoria, is a sign normally that the government has lost control, that they've failed to achieve consensus within the House, because no matter how much parties may disagree on the details of a bill, there's normally, if the government's doing its job, a consensus approach to the timing of the passage of legislation. When they have to use closure in the system, it's really an admission of failure, that they're going against not only the opposition party normally in the House, but against the public that they're supposed to represent.
All right, as a partisan person, which you are, Social Democrat leader of the National NDP, after 4 days of continuous night and day debate, legislation by exhaustion, when social credit applied closure like that, were they entitled, and if not, how would you describe their actions?
I do not in the slightest think they were entitled because the legislation they're trying to get through is terrible legislation. It's a classic case if a government that was elected with a majority recognized that just because you have a majority, you don't have the right to do whatever you want. What the government ought to have done, in my view, instead of bringing in closure, is to recognize what they're doing is unacceptable, not only to the opposition, but to the vast majority of the people in the province of British Columbia. A poll that came out since I've been here has indicated that while most British Columbians are in favor of some kind of restraint legislation, they're totally opposed to this. So the government, instead of bringing in closure, ought to have amended their own legislation. Then they might have got it passed.
Mr. Broadbent, you made the strangest statement I've had in a long while just
Never.
now.
I made one doctor to another made a strange statement.
Take 2 aspirins and go to bed, because you'll need it when I'm finished with you this morning.
Do you extra bill as well now that you're a doctor?
No, I don't extra bill, and you're deliberately trying to put me off.
I'd never do that.
As if it were a question period in the House of Commons. I've forgotten.
See, well, now, Jack, could I ask you, are you enjoying your medical profession now that you've become a doctor?
I'm not a doctor of medicine. Don't be silly, Ed Broadbent. What the hell is the question?
I think this is terrible. You're doing an interview first thing in the morning, and you're supposed to put me on the spot.
I'll tell you what the question was. You said that this government won the election,
Yes.
but did not have a mandate to do as it wishes. You well know that politicians make promises they never keep, and that Bennett has a mandate under the British parliamentary system to do whatsoever he wishes if he can pass it in the House with a majority.
I well know just the opposite. I well know that a government that has a majority has the right to introduce legislation in the House, but it also has, well established in our system, an obligation to produce legislation that gains some support, and that's the question of judgment.
But he's got public support.
No,
the public is
excuse
going
me.
about this province saying, shut them up, they've talked long enough, they've spoken 47 hours, 87 hours, for God's sake, pass the bills and get on with your work.
Excuse me, my reading of the poll that was done on the weekend is that he does not have public support. The people are against the specifics that he's bringing in. He ought to know that. Every newspaper, as I understand it, in this province, the radio stations, as well as NDP opposition members, have been saying you don't tear up human rights provisions that have been in this province a long time. You don't whack away at senior citizens. You don't tear up the working rights of laboring men and women. He's doing all of these things that he had no mandate for, and he ought to recognize he doesn't have a mandate and be democratic enough to amend his legislation. Then he could get it through the House.
He has a mandate which he has taken, which ends by statute law in Bill 2, the contract of a trade union. And in case nobody's... Have you been filled in on this legislation?
In general.
All right, in specific. He has a mandate which says that as of October 31st, the BC GEU is stripped of many of its major bargaining rights. He's ending the current contract by law. Now, surely in this time of national crisis, it's time that a provincial premier had guts enough to curb the power of unions so he can balance his budget. Do you not agree that he has that power?
No.
He has the power.
He has the power, but does he have the right to do that? Absolutely not.
But if he has the power, he has the right.
What kind of statement is that from a Democrat? No, because you have the power.
I'm not pretending to be a Democrat. I'm pretending to be a simple citizen who wants to see Bennett get his job done and get on with it.
Because you have the power doesn't give you the right. If right means the moral right to do anything you wish. You do not have the right to tear up 20 years of progress in this province, 20 years that have established for the trade union movement, as well as in other aspects of life in this province, a whole system of rights that he's tearing up. And I would argue he doesn't have that right.
All right, is this therefore the time, if I've outlined this properly to you, and I'll agree, he's gutted the Human Rights Code, he's wiped out other mediation and conciliation matters, he's evicted the rentalsmen, he's smashed the BC GEU contract by statute. Is this the time when good people should engage in civil disobedience?
It's the time when good people should combine, as they have in a movement out here called Solidarity, that involves politicians, church people, all kinds of normal people who aren't otherwise working together. It's a time for oppositions to do their job in the legislature, which is what they've been doing.
Peacefully and quietly with no civil disobedience.
Politicians should obey the law.
Operation Solidarity should obey the law.
Operation Solidarity should obey the law. Jack Monroe, leader of the IWA, says you obey the law. I agree with that.
What would happen if a bunch of people had occupied Trudeau's office in the East Bloc? My God.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure many would want to go into the inner sanctum.
There you go again. You're going to give me a smart line.
No, I wouldn't give you a smart. I would not. I was a politician. Politicians, by definition, never have smart lines. They're sober, serious, and responsible, like broadcasters.
I'll take a break, for goodness sake. I'll be back with Dr. Broadbent after the break. I saw a silly story out of Ottawa. It may have been you who originated it, Mr. Broadbent, that if Bennett passes certain legislation, that appeals are going to be made to the International Labour Organization in Geneva, saying that Canada's breaking international conventions. That's surely a piece of garbage, isn't it?
I'm not sure it's a piece of garbage. We signed a convention in 1935 that laid down a commitment on the part of the Government of Canada to establishing minimum rights in terms of being able to organize. And I think I've heard one lawyer make a good case that the Bill 2 or 3, and I think parts of both, go against that principle. There's another convention that the Government of Canada hasn't yet ratified, but has been looking at up to this point, and that's one passed in '48 with specific reference to public sector employees having the right to negotiate their conditions of work. Well, that clearly is violated in terms of the provisions of Bill 3.
Nobody knows better than you the kerfuffle if Trudeau or somebody in Ottawa tried to tell British Columbia they couldn't pass their own legislation. Oh, my goodness.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Trudeau, of course, has trouble being able to tell anyone outside his own backbenchers anything with any credibility right now. But the reality is, if you have national standards, if you have a Charter of Rights, it holds in British Columbia, it holds in Quebec, it holds in Atlantic Canada, and if it's being violated by any provincial government, that ought to be pointed out.
Under this new abrasive legislation, we still have the union shop, the dues check off, the right to strike, and certification. That meets any international standards of the ILO. However, let's leave it at that. How badly are you doing in Ottawa now that this great, smooth, lantern-jawed wit, Mr. Mulroney, who looked terrific that first day in the House of Commons, he's going to get pride of place on television?
Well, he's had a wonderful first day. Any sensible person, I think, will concede that. He came into the House and handled himself in an exchange with the Prime Minister in a more than adequate manner. But as unbiased as I'm not, it is, in my view, sort of been downhill since. That when he came in, they had one position on the Crow rate issue. They've changed that. They had one position on the new security force legislation. They've changed that. When he came in, he seemed to stand for the language legislation, the official language legislation from coast to coast. And yet he has failed to say that what he fought for in Quebec, he's prepared to fight for in Manitoba. He said that the jobs issue was the #1 issue. I think he has only asked one question in 2 weeks on the jobs issue. And in that, he contradicted himself a number of times in the question period on jobs. In short, Mr. Mulroney has either left a totally confused position about what the Conservative Party stands for, and to some extent a confused position about what he himself stands for.
I think you've forgotten one, or maybe you covered it vaguely. He was sandbagged by, of all people, Axworthy on the question of subsidies to transportation on the East Coast.
And anyone who makes Axworthy look good has got to be bad.
No. This man, Mulroney, is bound to be the new Prime Minister of this country, is he not?
No, he's not bound to be the new Prime Minister of this country. We've got, I think, at least 12 months before an election, and the more he is around, the longer he is around, I think that the greater opportunity Canadians are going to have to see what the Tories really stand for. And I remain very optimistic over the next 12 months about the downward prospects of the Conservatives and the upward prospects about ourselves.
Well, you're up to what, 20% in the polls now?
20%.
How many votes did you get in the last election? Was it
The same.
2 million? 4 million?
Well, Jack, I can't give you the number. But 1 out of 5 Canadian voters voted for us in the last election. If we had seats proportionate to that, we'd have 50-plus seats.
Yeah, but you're in the same box as a Mulroney on the language proposition in Manitoba, are you not?
No.
You support official bilingualism for Manitoba?
We have supported the principle of the legislation going through the process in Manitoba from the time it was introduced.
Does Paulie the Premier support it?
Of course, Paulie the Premier supports it, and he deserves some courage. I mean, one brief note on how we got to where we are. First of all, in Manitoba there was a Supreme Court decision that if it were implemented, if it were processed all the way through, they'd have to translate into French everything that was passed since 1870.
Right. That was stupid.
Absolutely stupid, ridiculous. The Francophone community and the Paulie government said that's silly. Let's agree to ignore that, because the Francophone community could have insisted, and if we go back to that, they may ultimately have to force the whole legislature and the people of Manitoba to pay for that. So they negotiated a compromise based on that Supreme Court decision that most sensible people, I would argue, would agree with. The Conservatives in the province of Manitoba have attacked it, and that's why we're in a bit of a mess. I'm looking forward to see what Mr. Mulroney does in the next few days.
I thought he'd handled it rather well and was not going to talk about it until he did conferences with everybody. You say he's just dodging.
No, I want to be careful on that. I'm not saying he's dodging. I'm saying I'm looking forward to seeing what he will do after both he and myself see the resolution that Mr. Trudeau has prepared.
What about the rights of English speakers in Quebec? They're still severely trampled on.
The key provision, I think, of Bill 101 that's objectionable has been the clause that says if you move, or any English-speaking Canadian moves to Quebec and wants to educate his children or her children in the English language, they can't do that. They have to do it in French schools. That's objectionable. That's something that the leaders of all parties have opposed. But apart from that, there should be no illusion. English-speaking Quebecers or English-speaking Canadians going into Quebec have the same rights that they've always had.
All right, now the state of the nation at the moment, please. Are we on a downward slide still? Are we going to continue on a downward slide? Regardless of your politics?
Not necessarily downward, but the signs are. The report we got out of Paris last week, reporting on the Canadian economy, says next year is going to be just as bad. Now, so it's not necessarily going to get worse, but that's bad because it means we're going to have 1.5 million unemployed. It means 1 out of 5 young people in British Columbia won't be able to get a job. It will mean that all kinds of men and women who would damn well prefer to be working instead of collecting welfare aren't going to be working unless this government we have does a major shift in terms of economic policy to begin to turn things around.
I mean, for the ordinary guy in the street, it's impossible to see, even if your much vaunted industrial strategy when implanted tomorrow, how it's going to bring jobs to ordinary people. When the world trade is down, the price of lumber's gone down $100 a thousand more or less, our exports have gone to hell in a handbasket. Not even your industrial strategy could help us.
Okay, let me make a couple of points on a complicated issue. First of all, other countries aren't down like that. Austria, Sweden have unemployment of only 3% right now, a quarter of ours. What would we do? I just came from the Kootenays. I had a marvelous couple of days in that region of the province. Symbolic of this whole province, because lumber products, mining products are the key there. And we, in British Columbia, you have a net deficit in mining and forest product equipment. When there is an upturn, we'll be buying equipment from Sweden, from the US, from Japan, to process in our own mines, to finish our paper products. If we had the facilities here in Canada, here in British Columbia, to produce that equipment here instead of importing it, we'd have an additional 20 to 30,000 jobs. Now that's the kind of thing the NDP is talking about. You don't just dig up your raw materials and export your lumber. If you're going to continue doing some of that, there should be no illusion about that, but you should also begin to have a manufacturing base that's related
Government subsidized, incentives for big business, incentives for the corporate rip-off.
Let me give, a corporate tax reduction for investment to encourage it to go into those sectors, but not corporate tax cuts across the board. That's the difference between us and the Liberals and the Tories. They just give handouts across the board, we would target investment like that to get jobs.
Two other things, and we'll take calls as well with Dr. Ed Broadbent after the break. I see your people are now trying to use the Charter of Rights to prevent us from keeping our commitments to our allies on the cruise. You'll go to any lengths to weaken the Western Alliance, won't you?
We have this bizarre notion that charters of rights should apply to Canadians and maintain their rights. That's true. And we also have this bizarre notion, which I stress we share with the former head of the CIA, with a former Secretary of Defense in the United States, that we don't need another nuclear weapon on either side. So it's hardly a sort of NDP preoccupation. It's one that's accepted by sensible people on both sides of the Canada-US border as well as other people around the world.
Quite surprising. It's going to court, isn't it?
Well, if the Prime Minister could have anything to do with it, he wouldn't like it. He would try
What
to
is
stop
he?
it.
Is he a hawk or a dove or just whatever he happens to be when he gets up that morning?
Absolutely, he is. So whatever gives power and influence to himself and the Liberal Party is what he is. I mean, I was astounded last week in the House when he indicated that he wanted to go around the Charter of Rights, which he was instrumental in bringing to this country. One has to give him some credit for that. And then he made the preposterous argument that the Charter of Rights couldn't, including checking the unwarranted power of Cabinet in terms of its taking away the rights of ordinary Canadians. And that's, of course, what a charter is supposed to be all about, is to check cabinets.
To check cabinets?
As well as legislatures, as well as other institutions that would deny fundamental rights.
This has been my fear all the way.
Pardon?
This has been my fear all the way, that we're giving the power to run the country to a bunch of, not necessarily, to many judges politically appointed instead of the rascals whom we can throw out whenever we want to.
They're given power, in the case of the Cabinet, of the Charter.
Nobody mentioned during the Charter that this could clip the wings of the Cabinet.
They damn well did, to be blunt, including myself. Where the Charter would come into play is if the Cabinet decided that everyone with a Scottish background named Webster should be put in jail on every third Sunday of the month, and under our parliamentary system, before we had the Charter, a Cabinet with parliamentary approval could do that.
Pass a law, so to do.
Could do it. Now, with the Charter, they couldn't do it, and because it affects human rights. That's where you can check Cabinet abuse of power when it comes to human rights, not in other decisions.
Now,
and therefore, in my view, that's precisely why we need a charter.
Does that segment apply all across the country now?
Yes.
So that might be used conceivably, not likely, but conceivably, by the opposition in Victoria to check the powers of the Cabinet.
It is. It could be. It could be applied to the legislation going through Victoria right now. In fact, we're having some lawyers look at the Charter of Rights exactly in the context of the BC legislation.
That puts us right into the American system of checks and balances outside of government.
The Americans were not wrong about everything.
No, but I'm correct, am I?
No, it is, in terms of the purpose of a charter is to set certain limitations on legislatures to protect the citizens.
And on cabinets.
And on cabinets.
And on the total power of the government.
Yes, indeed.
So any man who goes up under the new straightened legal aid laws in British Columbia who can't get money because he's got a previous conviction can go to the Charter of Rights for an instant remedy.
Not an instant remedy, but he may, under the provisions there, may be able to make a case of his freedom of access to law, his freedom to have his rights protected.
Rights to retain
jeopardized.
counsel.
Yes.
But the Charter doesn't say who's going to pay the bill.
No.
Should the federal government pay for all legal aid denied by provincial governments? Would an NDP government do that?
No, that would be irresponsible in terms of making that commitment. To say that it should move in and spend wherever the province fails to do its job.
Next question. As a man at the pinnacle of the heap, you know, you're running third, the poor third, but you're still up there at the top.
Oh, you're abusive. And you're such a friendly guy normally.
I'm accurate.
Eh?
You're running third.
That's right.
In the
Well,
polls.
we'll leave it at that.
Give me your definitive, scholarly, critical assessment of the man whom everybody says has got to go, Trudeau. What's wrong with Trudeau? This man of incredible charisma and power of recovery.
What's wrong with Mr. Trudeau, I think, basically, is he doesn't have his heart, to use an old phrase, in the right place. He has a...
Where is his heart?
God knows. It's been speculated as to whether or not he has one. But he really doesn't have, I think, that kind of rapport and feeling of sympathy with ordinary people's problems. It's all too much a cerebral, intellectual activity for him. And that's caused a lot of problems in this country of ours.
Should he quit?
Should he quit?
Is it time somebody got up and said, in the name of God, go?
I think that time is long overdue. I think that whatever service he had for the country, and there were some, especially on constitutional matters, he's performed that service, and he should go on to other things.
He should go.
Quick.
He should get out.
Faster.
As fast as possible.
Absolutely.
Have you a personal message for Premier Bennett, who will be taping this show, to see if you're going to say anything about him this morning, so he can give the proper response? What would your advice be to Premier Bennett this morning?
My advice to Premier Bennett would be to stop using closure, but instead withdraw your bills, amend them sensibly, listen to the people of your province, and you'll probably be able to get them through the legislature after that.
Questions to Ed Broadbent, National Leader of the New Democratic Party, after the break. How long, sir, have you been National Leader of the New Democratic Party?
333 years.
That makes you 386, therefore.
That's very good.
How old are you?
That's good for a doctor.
How old are you?
How old? I'm 47.
Sure taking its
Oh,
toll.
you've set yourself up now. How old are you?
65 going on 66.
And you don't look it.
I know, it's a makeup.
No, you look older. I didn't mean younger.
Go ahead to Ed Broadbent.
Yes, Mr. Broadbent?
Yes.
Yes, I have two questions. One on the cruise missile. Isn't it true that there was never a NATO request for the cruise missile? And in fact, the air-launched cruise is destined for the United States Air Force, 3,000 of them, as a matter of fact. I just want you to collaborate on that, my statement. And
Yeah.
secondly, you made the statement that a politician should always obey the law. And I just want to ask you, should a politician, or a citizen for that matter, obey an unjust law?
Two questions.
Two good ones. The latter more difficult, and I'll come to it right away. The first question, was it a NATO requirement that we test the cruise? Of course it was not. And Flora MacDonald, who is in fact the minister in Mr. Clark's government at the time, has said publicly there was absolutely no agreement in NATO that said Canada should test the cruise. It's been a bogus argument that Trudeau has used all along. The second question you raise is very important, obviously. At what point should an unjust law warrant, if you like, this civil disobedience? My own personal demarcation on that is if you have laws that inflict physical violence on people, that would put people in jail, that would deny them the right to participate in politics. In short, if you have right-wing dictatorships or left-wing dictatorships that take away fundamental human liberties, i.e. the right to change government itself, then that kind of law could be morally disobeyed.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Broadbent. Since
Yes.
Vladimir Ilyich Lenin taught his followers that the best way to bring an enemy country down on its knees is to debauch its money and cripple its economy by infiltrating and organizing its labor unrest, and since money-wise, the same kind of state takeover of private banks which the NDP advocates for Canada, with foreign exchange controls against money leaving the country, have already failed miserably in France and been instrumental in its economic collapse and resulted with rebellion and even bloodied street rioting against Francois Mitterrand's socialist government in France. Why do you still push the same evil curse on us here in Canada? To what purpose and in whose benefit? Why?
And have you stopped beating your wife?
Only to have you dictate to me how I can spend my hard-earned cash and what I can buy with it.
Okay.
Well, I want to deal with your question seriously. I take it you're saying that what we're advocating is the same as what Francois Mitterrand has brought in France. On the whole, that isn't so. We're in a different economy and we've made different kinds of proposals. There's some similarity in terms of stimulus in the economy. Mr. Mitterrand was out of phase, to be perfectly blunt, with what was going on in Western Europe. So he decided to stimulate his economy a year ago by offering more money out there for people to spend, and as a result, because Germany hadn't, the other conservative countries around him were going in the opposite direction. What you saw was an outflow of capital from France, people buying imported goods that created problems. Now, if all the countries in Western Europe had taken the same course of action as Mr. Mitterrand, in my judgment, the French economy wouldn't have gone into the problems it did.
You're not out to wreck the economy on the lines of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin by debasing Western currency.
No, I think people.
Are you a
I think Mr. Bennett and Mr. Trudeau would be more guilty of that accusation than the NDP.
There's still a fair amount of the old dogma around, isn't there?
Yeah, but it's interesting. In the dogma, if I may be blunt about the man who's just phoned in, you find more dogma, I find these days, people on the right of the political spectrum, who are the extremists. The
Go ahead,
like
please.
Mr. Bennett.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
Mr. Broadbent,
Yes, sir.
may I say that between yourself and the Liberals, I'm appalled at both parties in interfering with what's going on in Manitoba when it's going through their legislation. I'm really disgusted. The only reason you guys are doing it, and understand that I'm a conservative.
I suspected that.
Okay, well, I'm trying to be upfront.
Yes.
The only reason you guys are riding the Manitoba issue now is to pick on our leader of the Conservatives as best as you can, to downgrade him, and for no other purpose.
No.
For the simple fact that it's going through their legislation, and you don't like your legislation being interfered from the outside, neither do they. Now, my second point is this. I am really tired of the fact that you... I'm sorry, I'm really uptight.
It's okay.
I'm really tired of the fact that every time government touches anything, the post office, the insurance in British Columbia, wherever, governments are great for making rules, but they should not be in business. And you people advocate people being in business. I think that's wrong, and it's expensive, as it's being proved in France.
Okay. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, let me pick up the two items. Let me begin, sir, by agreeing with the unstated assumption behind your comment about Mr. Mulroney. I do not want to embarrass Mr. Mulroney, and I stress that. I want anything that the federal parliament to do to be the product of the three parties in the House of Commons. And do not want, on this issue above all others perhaps in the country, which is so potentially explosive, that of language rights, do not want it to become a partisan concern. And the only difficulty, if you like, in this is that that's emerged is, and it's created problems for Mr. Mulroney, and it could have happened to any leader in his position, i.e. he has committed himself to language rights, but he has a provincial leader in Manitoba who is publicly on the opposite side of this issue. Now, that's not Mr. Mulroney's fault, and I agree with that. And anything we do in Ottawa, Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Trudeau and I should probably be meeting later this week or early next week. I hope that we can come out of that with an agreement either to do nothing, if we can't agree, or come up with a common resolution and keep it out of partisan politics at the national level.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Broadbent. I'm just wondering if how long we can go on with the idea of exporting most of our jobs while importing labor in terms of immigrants. To me, it's self-defeating. And secondly, could we not go back to a 32-hour week, or go to a 32-hour week? Would that not knock off half the unemployment in Canada? Thank you.
Well, two parts to that question. I think we have to turn around the exporting of jobs. It can't be done overnight. The only way we can do it is the way other industrial nations have done it, which is to sort of use the corporate tax structure and some public activity to get investment in manufacturing here instead of importing all those manufactured goods. It takes time, but it ought to be done the way other countries have done it. The second...
immigration? Stop immigration. We're getting about 156,000 people this year, half of them on family reunification and half of them as individual immigrants. He wants to stop them.
I don't think he said that.
Yes, he did.
Is he gone? Well, anyway, the flow of immigration has virtually stopped because of high levels of unemployment.
Go ahead from Kelowna.
Yes, good morning, Jack. Good morning, Mr. Broadbent.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good to see you.
Nice.
I wanted two questions answered. Could you tell me, please, is it true that the federal government is going to take a look at the BC legislation when it's finished? And if so, what action can the BC or the federal government take?
Well, the Minister of Justice, in reply to a question I put to him in the House last week on this issue, implied exactly that. He said the legislation isn't yet through the process in Victoria, and after that the government will be looking at it. The government has done that with similar kinds of legislation that was passed in the province of Quebec, where the federal government, after it was passed in Quebec, legally supported a group in the province of Quebec that is challenging that legislation. So the government of Canada, the Liberals, not only can take that action, in my view, they should.
Under the new Constitution, said Webster, dredging back his brain, is there a power to disallow, as there was in the case of the infamous Alberta Press Act of the 30s or 40s?
It's a power that shouldn't be used.
Is it in the new Constitution?
Yes, yeah.
There is power to disallow.
Yes, and I do not think that it should be used.
One more segment with Ed Broadbent after the break. Ed Broadbent, national leader of the NDP. Oh yeah, you said Trudeau would go. When's he bound?
Go.
Should go.
Should, yeah, not
Will he
necessarily-
go?
no,
Will he go?
That's like predicting the weather for Christmas Day. I don't know.
Okay, when will the election be?
November 8th, 1984.
That's the maximum.
That's it. No, that's the day I'm calling it. You heard it here first.
November 8th, 84.
If you believe that, you believe anything.
Well, look at the number of people that vote for you, name of goodness. Go ahead from 100 Mile House.
Yeah, morning, Jack.
Morning. Speak up.
I'd like to ask Mr. Broadbent one question.
Go ahead, sir.
He was the Premier of BC in Bennett's place right now. What would he do to change the economy around?
Well, that's what I'd do is, first of all, I'd withdraw that legislation and try to get some reasonable compromise in it. I would take steps to discourage rather than encourage more foreign investment of the kind that was just going to come in and sort of rip and run with resources. I would bring in an effective, through the state power, the provincial power that exists, low interest rate policy, but restrict it to small businesses that are Canadian owned to encourage them to expand, particularly in the manufacturing sector. I won't go beyond that because it would be presumptuous to have a detailed knowledge of the provincial economy.
Yeah. But you would certainly endorse the $600,000 the Liberals gave to the Unemployment Action Centre, which finished up working in part for Solidarity.
What a smile. I don't know anything about that, Jack.
One of Jack Austin's great embarrassments. I won't bother giving you the detail. Now will I ask? Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. Short question to you and a question to Mr. Broadbent. You made a statement.
I'm not here to answer any questions.
Yeah, pin him down. I like this.
Point then, may I? You made the statement Mr. Bennett has power, so he has the right. Now, Hitler had power. Did he have the right? Now, my next question to Mr. Broadbent.
Well, let me answer the question.
You got him.
I made my statement as a provocateur. If he has the power, he has the right. There are degrees of power and degrees of rectitude, and I said on the air the other day, if there was the kind of legislation which Hitler used, I'd be out in the streets along with you with a club, a barricade, and a gun.
Hear, hear.
That's a different thing altogether. Now your question to Broadbent.
Now, Mr. Broadbent, I've lived in Canada all my life, and it's quite clear to me that the system we're under, which is a free enterprise system, is not working. Now, I, as a taxpayer, do not like the Conservative government or the Liberal government bailing out large businesses, large corporations with my tax money, and also now the Conservatives are bugging them every day, because I watch the cities every day, for bailouts of small businesses. Now, I understood that free enterprise, if you couldn't make it, you went down the tube, and the poor taxpayer didn't have to bail you out.
That's what Bennett's trying to do in BC.
All right, briefly stated, I agree with your criticism that the way that the old line parties, as we call them, normally interfere in the economy is to bail out losers. When they're going down, instead of letting them go down, as most of them should in the market system, they give them millions of dollars of taxpayers' money. I am not in favor of that as a principle. There can be certain exceptions. But instead, what we want in our party is to plan a mixed economy and have a corporate tax policy that would encourage growth in key sectors that are relevant to our economy, but not provide the same tax benefits in others.
Gosh, I've heard you say that so often.
Well, we should start doing it.
It's one of the reasons you're so unglamorous in the NDP. You don't take any extreme positions.
We don't take any extra. Well, the Liberals or Tories aren't
except
saying
in
that.
certain areas, which I tend not to raise this morning.
That's very charitable of you.
It's very charitable of me. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. Ed.
Good morning.
Can either of you tell me who was the Premier of BC during the Hungry 30s?
During the Hungry 30s, that was prior to Bennett.
John T. Duff Patella was the one prior to Bennett, and prior to that was John Hart.
Okay, but I was referring more or less specifically to R.B. Bennett and all the damage.
Oh, that wasn't
No,
BC.
he was after. He was Mr.
He was federal government.
That was a conservative. He was the no relation to the Bennett of this province. He was the former conservative Prime Minister of Canada.
Oh, this is what it was. Thanks very much.
Okay.
See how well I've educated viewers in BC. They thought R.B. Bennett was Billy's father.
A part of the same gang. Well, the Conservatives are connected with the Bennetts now. I mean, Mr. Mulroney's, one of his key workers was Mr. Bennett's principal advisor. 3 cabinet ministers from the Bennett government were at the Conservative Party convention. There's a pretty close tie-in, I would say.
Well, that was where one of your members performed. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hello. Do you support greater investment in education, the negative income tax system, and do you have any guess on how the budget locally can be up 12%?
What was the last of the 3?
He wants to know if you know why the budget is up 12% locally. In this time of restraint...
No, I don't know why. I mean, I think you're making a point that in this time of restraint, Mr. Bennett himself is already spending a lot of money, so, and he's trying to have it both ways. The negative income tax, for a variety of complicated reasons I won't go into now, the answer is no.
Go ahead from Williams Lake again. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Doug.
Morning.
Yeah, I want to make a few points. If this legislation is passed, you're not going to end up with people that don't care anymore. They're going to have nothing to care about, which is, in turn, you're only going to end up with violence and criminals in jail. What's Bennett going to do if he has to lock everybody up? You take away education and Medicare, and you separate people. You're going to have the 3 biggest killers, which is jealousy, paranoia, financial pressure. That's why Bennett's so against his Operation Solidarity, because people are working together, they're sticking together. Operation Solidarity isn't going to die. It's only going to get stronger. We're not going to stand back and let the people of this province forget in this event in the next election. When you take away people's rights, the people that have fought and died and gone to jail for everything that is happening right now, you're repeating history. Now, if you were to study the ologies, anthropology, archaeology, astrology, biology, chemology, histology, methodology, sociology, technology, put them into order the way it's written in any dictionary, any encyclopedia, you come up, ending up with technology.
Okay, ma'am. There's a woman who's obviously quite distraught and predicts violence and civil disorder. I don't, not at this particular stage. Things are bad, things are tough. I presume this country of Canada can continue, regardless of the economic pressure, to support UIC and welfare payments for an indefinite future.
Well, it would be a hell of a lot smarter if we, instead of spending $1 billion a month on unemployment insurance, which is what we're doing now, we started channeling some of that investment, that money, into creating jobs in a serious way. But her point, I think, is there was a lament that we heard from the woman, obviously, who's deeply concerned. I agree with her that if you're destroying all these human rights, you're taking away, well, basically progress that's been made in this province for the past 20 years, you're going to create a lot of very unhappy people.
Of course you will, but you've got to understand that Bennett's aims and objects are probably supported by a majority of people. It's only his priorities seem to have upset a lot of pressure groups.
Well, if the priority was restraint, and who is going to argue against that? It's like saying you're opposed. It's right. It's like saying you're against honesty. But if you, as I understand the poll that was done, that was published on the weekend, refer to all these specific bills that take away fundamental rights, the people of this province clearly have indicated they're opposed.
Anyway, Ed Broadbent, back in the House of Commons tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Out here to campaign for Barrett, help him on the way.
Working together, as Dave and I always do.
Pity you lost Mission Port Moody, wasn't it?
It was, but we'll be back.
If Barrett had run, you'd have won it, wouldn't you?
I think so.
I
know so.
Are you mad at him about it?
I am not mad at Dave. I want him to run federally, though, again, when the election comes.
For sure.
For sure.
You're leaning on him. Publicly.
I never lean on Dave. He's a big boy to lean on.
My thanks to Ed Broadbent. Next, a man whom I haven't interviewed for a couple of years, but looking forward to it very much this morning, Senator Ray Perrault, after the break. I covered the nominating convention at which Ray Perrault became the leader of the Liberal Party in 1959, and since then he's been in and out, up and down like a jack-in-the-box, but he was appointed by Mr. Trudeau to the Senate, in which he became the House leader. What year were you appointed?
I was appointed in 1974, Jack, following the federal election. I was campaign chairman in 74 when we won a few seats out here.
That's right.
The last time I think we won anything significantly.
And you've been in the Senate how long now?
I've been in the Senate now since 74, almost 9 years, 10 years, almost 10 years.
Ray, you and I are old friends politically and socially, and we've had many a dust up in a barn, the up and down, on air, especially on radio, one hysterical day.
That's right.
I was absolutely shocked when I saw you turn on Trudeau when you first left the cabinet, attacking the man of whom you've been the most faithful and loyal servant of any Liberal in the country.
Well, I haven't...
Why did you turn on him?
Jack, I haven't turned on the Prime Minister. I have turned on some of the advice he's receiving. He's not an organizer. He's said many occasions to me personally, I think he said to you too, he doesn't understand British Columbia. His specialty is policy, it's not organization, and I think some of his advisors are giving him some bad advice.
But he's got to be it's got to be his fault. You must blame Trudeau for accepting this bad advice.
Ultimately, he has to accept some of the responsibility for the advice, but his advice is not sound. The perverse notion, for example, that you can continue the existence of the Liberal Party in British Columbia and in Canada without support in all of the regions. The Greater Toronto strategy, the Keith Davey concept that if you do well in Greater Toronto, somehow that's enough. And
You put it much stronger than that. Did you not say, Ray Perrault, that he was trying to become Prime Minister again based entirely on the votes of Ontario and Quebec?
No, I didn't say it in quite that fashion, but I do believe that in '79, Western policy guidance was not listened to. It's not being listened to now by many people. But I want to qualify it by saying this. I've had calls from 7 Greater Toronto ministers and MPs in the past 2 weeks sympathizing with everything I've said. They say they think there is a real danger to the existence of the party in having a strategy which is so primarily Eastern-based. So when I speak out, it's not a voice in the wilderness. It's the opinion of many, many Liberals in Western Canada and across the country.
You were the House leader in the Senate.
Yes, I was. And no Western minister was more outspoken in cabinet than Ray Perrault, and I'm not ashamed of that record.
I'm well aware of that myself from my own keyhole listening. Who got the job as whip, as House leader in the Senate?
Bud Olson of Alberta, who's excellent. And the new cabinet ministers are first rate, and I'm not just flanking the Liberal Party when I say that. They are, McLaren is excellent, David Smith, Collinette, they're good people.
Would this be a correct interpretation of your views? Webster speaking, interpreting Senator Perrault. That due to the bad advice the Prime Minister is getting and taking from the Keith Davies of the world and the Central and Eastern Canada clack, it's time that he surrendered the reins of power and was replaced by another man as the leader of the Liberal Party.
As long as he receives the advice he is now receiving and accepting in part, we're not going to win many seats in British Columbia. I'm going to leave the decision about leadership to him. I think he's going to step down around Christmas, Jack, and I think that Ed Broadbent is correct. I would say the federal election will not be any later than October of 1984. I think that that's the outer limit for an election.
You believe, with all the knowledge you have, although you're only speculating, you'll tell me, that Trudeau has made plans to quit in October 1984?
No, I think that probably he may step down around Christmas of this year.
Oh, Christmas.
And there would be a leadership convention, and the election would probably be in the fall, or it could conceivably be in the spring. I don't think he's going to run again. I'm desperately concerned about the survival of the Liberal Party from coast to coast. In 1979, I sounded a warning to the party, which I can tell you for the first time anywhere. I spoke to the organizational group of Liberals. I said, you may think that technically you can win the election in 1979. You may think that you can defeat the Clark government and sweep back in that 1980 campaign. But I said, you may do it and find there's not one elected Liberal in all of Western Canada, and then the Liberal Party has to look at the prospect of being a so-called national party without national representation.
And that happened.
Jack, it happened precisely, and Art Phillips said the same thing. And I think that what we cannot stand in the Liberal Party is another drought in Western Canada, or we're in danger of no longer being a national party. The best thing for the political system in this country would be for the Tories to win support in all regions of Canada and the Liberals to win support in all regions of Canada.
The fact is that the Liberal Party is not now a national party.
Not now a national party. And I do not want to see any of our leaders accept the advice of the manipulators, the people who pose as party strategists, who are more interested in party survival than they are in the continued viability of the Liberal Party as a national party. That's my concern.
Well, who is your nominee?
Mary moves now, and that's common knowledge.
12.
I think there'll be about a dozen.
Anybody from the West?
Yes.
Art Phillips?
There'll be at least 3 candidates from Western Canada, I rather expect.
Well, if you were to ask me to name candidates from Western Canada from the Liberal Party, mind you, I have a very superficial mind, as you well know. I'd think of Iona, Gordon Gibson.
Who's doing a great job as national president.
Oh, you're terrific. You're great at getting in the plug. Iona, Gordon Gibson Jr.,
I think Lloyd Axworthy's actively interested. Probably.
Do you suggest that he's a possible...
Well, I think that he sees himself as a possible national leader.
Yeah, good point.
You know, it's not a matter to be ashamed of to aspire to be national leader of a party. It's quite an honorable aspiration. And I don't think that any of the aspirants or the potential aspirants has done anything that untoward or unreasonable with respect to the present leader. I think they have not done anything publicly to embarrass him.
Were you kind of destroyed the morning you were fired from your job as House Leader and told, go about your business as an ordinary senator?
Jack, the word fired is not the word. I was offered a rather prestigious position some months ago by the Prime Minister, who has always been very good to me. And we had a discussion over a year ago, and he said, you know, you're from the Senate. You've been in the Senate longer than any other Senate minister. I may have to shake things up before the next election. I said, Prime Minister, put my name on the list. Precisely what we said. So it wasn't a surprise. You know, it's quite a normal aspect of the parliamentary system, Jack, as you know, to shuffle a cabinet once in a while. The British do it far more frequently than we do in Canada. It's not a dishonorable thing. It's something that is a normal, healthy procedure in the parliamentary system. The fact is, however, British Columbia should not have been reduced from 1 to 2, from 2 to 1. 2 to 1. This was an action which was opposed by every official and unofficial advisor to the party from the province of British Columbia. The association was against it. My colleague, Senator Jack, who's now burdened with so much work, was against it. And the rest of the party organization was against it. But the Greater Toronto organization, headed by Keith Davey, thought this was a good idea in order to increase Toronto representation. And one thing that we don't need is more strength in the province of Ontario and the Greater Toronto area, as much as I love my friends down there.
Would you include Kutz in that apparatus of power?
I have had no contact with Jim, and I don't know where he stood on it. But I do know that some of the Toronto strategists were responsible for it.
I've got to ask this. You can't answer it. But did Trudeau offer you a fancy job?
I have been well treated by the Prime Minister.
No, but did he offer you a fancy position?
Yes. And I'm not going to comment further. I'm not going to comment further, but he's been good to me. He's been a friend of mine for years. I don't want him to be misled by bad advice about a region which I know far more about, and Jack Austin knows far more about, and others know far more about than the advisors based in Toronto. So that's my position.
The sum up of Ray Perrault is the party must have renewal. You think Trudeau
Renewal is essential.
You think Trudeau...
The over-the-hill gang have to be booted down the hill as quickly as possible.
But Trudeau is the leader of the over-the-hill gang.
I'm not talking about leadership here. I'm talking about the advisors, some of the advisors which surround him. He's got some good people, but other people who are living in the past and don't know what Canada's all about.
Guarantee you're enjoying life 10,000 times more than before you were given your... The hoist.
Jack, because I've got more time in the province where I was born and raised, British Columbia, and I love it here. And incidentally, I hope that before too many months are out, that Ed Broadbent and the NDP are going to explain to British Columbians why they support the status quo with respect to the crow rate. It's one of the most perverse notions that we've ever encountered. So I'm still interested in some policy as well.
I don't understand that either. I forgot to ask him about the crow rate. Senator Ray Perrault, merely now an ordinary Liberal with a lifetime pension until the age of 75.
No, we're going to change the Senate within 2 years, and it's going to go, I think, to an elected format, Jack, and there may even be a place for you. We need you down there.
God forbid. After the break. Can I tell that little story on here?
Great.
One day when I was on radio in Gastown, Ray got absolutely livid at me, and he phoned up and he called me, I'll use the name, he called me a bigot on the air. And I went into orbit, and he went into orbit, we both went into orbit, and sitting in my studio was a Harley Street specialist, a psychiatrist, who was about to give me a little lecture, and he had with him a doctor from the General Hospital, on use of transcendental meditation for lower back pain. When you and I are screaming at each other, just one of our noisiest exchanges, this guy picks up his medical volumes and disappears. I take the break and I say to the doctor from the General, hey, what happened to Dr. So-and-so from Harley Street? And the doctor looked at me and says, he just whispered to me that he was not about to go on the air with such an obvious paranoid egomaniac such as yourself, Webster, and he wouldn't come back on the program. So it was you who ruined the guest that morning.
Great story.
True story. Go ahead, please.
Terrific.
Yeah, Senator Fogbound.
Oh, do you object to Senator Fogpound?
No, I don't object to him. I think that we've lost a cabinet minister, but we've gained a voice. His voice has never been with more clarity than I've heard in years.
Well, I am no longer, of course, bound by some of the strictures of cabinet. Let me say that I intend to do a lot of speaking about issues affecting British Columbia the next while.
Well, that's marvelous that you finally found your voice after so many years. I think maybe a number of cabinet appointments should be taken out of the cabinet so they could speak out. I think this is what's needed. Thank you very much.
I've had some remarkable mail, you know, from people of all parties. I can't even keep up with the replies, Jack, and it's gratifying at least.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I'd just like to say that I am very proud of our Prime Minister and thankful to him. I believe that the disaster that Bennett is currently creating in BC will be repeated if we have a Conservative federal government. And I'd like to know what I could do to support the BC Federal Liberal Party.
Well, there is a great effort being headed by Iona Campagnolo to build a new membership base for the party. There's a local office downtown on West Broadway. I don't want to get into commercials, Jack.
Please don't.
But we welcome that support.
Give me a short Perrault sum-up on Bennett's behavior.
Well, I think it's quite remarkable. I was 9 years in opposition, of course, in Victoria, and the father, I think, showed greater legislative skills or better political skills than the present Premier is demonstrating. Now, he has a considerably different economic situation here. There's no question about it, but I think some of the tactics have been clumsy. I think that some of his measures should be rethought and repackaged. And if they do finally become enacted into law, I think that we are prepared in Ottawa to have a look at them to see what we may be able to do, especially in those matters relating to human rights.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning, gentlemen. I wonder, the senators there, we got a bureaucratic problem with this formaldehyde, and it's very simple. They have a September the 30th deadline to make application, and you can only make application or get information by phone on the Hull, Quebec phone number. We spent since last Monday up till this morning and started at 5:30 this morning phoning that number, and we still can't get an answer. We still get a busy signal.
Why don't you get a list of all the names and the people who want to apply for the aid and get it to me? I'm going to go to Ottawa probably tomorrow morning. Is there some way I can get it from you?
Well, I don't know any other people who want to get it. That's just I'm purchasing to go home.
Well, I'll bring it by hand down to Ottawa if you can't get through to
If
that
you'll
number.
drop it off at the Liberal office downtown, they'll send it over to Ray. Ray will pick it up and take it.
Be glad to do it for you.
Okay, but it's in Hull, Quebec. It's not Ottawa.
Well, I don't know why we don't have a local informational number. We had one last year, I think, for formaldehyde cases, didn't we?
So I phoned CMAC just 10 minutes ago, and they said, we can't do a thing for you. You must phone Hull, Quebec.
Well, I'm going to make a note of that. That sounds unreasonable.
The deadline is this Friday.
All right, you get a letter down to the Liberal office, and Ray will take it to Ottawa for you.
Okay, thank you.
Be glad to do it.
Are you still doing a kind of MP thing? You're going to continue
I've traveled
doing
100. I'm still doing a lot of work.
I mean, for the constituents.
Well, yes, I'm doing constituency work.
You don't have the staff you used to have.
No, 6 staff members were closed out from British Columbia and transferred to Toronto as a result of this strategical move. And,
6 jobs.
And that doesn't suggest to me that there are at least some strategists in the party who care very much about British Columbia, and I'm annoyed about it.
Didn't even leave the office here.
No, the office has been closed
They just
down.
said Perrault's gone, close
the office is being removed to Toronto.
Were the people fired?
Some of them are just laid off and are unemployed.
Go ahead, please.
Some have been taken on in other offices.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Perrault.
Morning.
I'd like to ask you, do you think it's wise, if Mr. Trudeau steps down in December, as you suggest, that a new leader comes into place and Mr. Mulroney has the option of pounding the new leader for a matter of months before they go to the polls? Or do you think it's better for Mr. Trudeau to remain in office until closer to the election, where a new leader is not going to take the pounding from the opposition for a number of months?
Well, that's a very good question regarding tactics, and a good case can be made to have an election as quickly as possible after a new Liberal leader has been selected. And that may mean retirement around Christmas, and then a leadership convention in the spring and a June election. Could be something like that. But I think you've raised a very important point. Mr. Trudeau himself did this in '68, as you recall, Jack.
Hold on, please. Mr. Trudeau will go when he decides.
Yes, he will, and the party accepts that.
I mean,
if he stays on, of course, we'll do the very best we can to win.
Am I correct
seats.
in saying that he will not accept anybody's advice, that he will make his decision on his own?
Yes, he will. Yes, he will. We have no system in the Liberal Party, and I don't think the Conservatives have it either, whereby some committee decides when a leader goes or stays.
Technically speaking, and I'm not talking about Trudeau, a caucus of members of the House of Commons, though, and it's happened in the United Kingdom, can declare the lack of confidence in the Prime Minister, and he goes.
Yes, they send very strong signals. We had a caucus meeting. The first caucus meeting in Ottawa was a very interesting one in Ottawa. Of course, I can't comment about it, but it's no secret that leadership was on that agenda as well.
Go ahead from Prince George.
Yeah, I'd like to rebound something, Jack, that was said regarding your part there with Ed Broadbent. Ray Perrault has had a lot of contact federally, and he's also says he's familiar with British Columbia. And I'd just like to scenario something and see what he says about it. We've got, throughout Canada, we've got a federal and provincial split. Obviously, we have an east-west problem. There's even language splits. I know you stated, Jack, that you don't feel there'd be any civil disobedience problems coming in the future, but why federally are we hearing things about internment camps throughout Canada, War Measures Act, gun control, the Bennett government now trying to more or less handcuff labor unity in British Columbia? I'm not so sure, Jack, I can go along with you. I was just wondering what Ray Perrault would feel. How much can the Canadian people take? How much can the British Columbian people take before they say that's enough?
Well, now,
Being pushed around.
as far as those stories which have been circulated that somehow we want to go into internment camps, that's completely ridiculous. You know, Mr. Stevenson, the great wartime security expert for Canada, who's just won the Order of Canada, and his namesake wrote a book about him. You recall that, Jack?
Intrepid.
A man called Intrepid. He was on television this past weekend and made a statement. He said that we need this new security agent as quickly as possible. He said the enemy is not only outside our homes, he's in our rooms in the Canadian home. We need improved security in this country, but we are not going to violate human rights in the process. The government brought in the Canadian Charter of Rights. We're not going to bring in internment camps. The attempt of the opposition to say somehow we're going to establish security holding areas for innocent people is just ridiculous.
I know, but we've seen through elections and that the Canadian people can be apathetic. They can procrastinate when it comes to getting involved in some issue. They seem to be quiet. But, you know, I don't think people are that quiet anymore. I think you're going to see in the future Canadians being, you know, typically pushed too far, deciding to stand up.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think that people are more aware of national issues. They're better informed and better educated. I think you're right.
And television makes a hell of a difference.
It does indeed.
The medium is the message. After the break. Mind you, speaking philosophically, as we are not wont to do, we've got a whole generation of 2 generations, maybe even 3 generations of people brought up in post-war affluence, to whom everything came very easily. I mean, things were much better than, say, before the 1926 collapse, or the 1928 collapse. And when you take away from people that to which they have become accustomed, you know, the fancy houses, the 2 cars, the good money, the easy job, the meals out, and people see this crunch ahead for whatever reason, they're liable to get a little uneasy.
Yes, they are liable to get uneasy.
And I mean, if
progress is no longer automatic.
If anybody messes about with Medicare, and Medicare does not become a matter of right, but wherever to become a matter of money, there'd be real trouble.
This could be an issue, the issue in the next federal campaign, in my view. I think Canadians are probably prepared to pay more money for their premiums, but they don't want to lose the universal character and quality of Medicare.
There must be universal Medicare, and it must be of
I agree.
universal standard. It mustn't be Medicare for the rich, the middle class, and the poor.
You can't have a situation that we had years ago, remember, Jack, when some spokesman for the medical profession would say, well, just send us your poor people. We'll find some doctor able to look after
I
them.
remember having to borrow money to get my wife out of hospital.
Sure.
In BC.
I agree.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
That's you, sir.
Jack.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Perrault in regards to West Coast shipbuilding.
Right, carry on.
I would like to know if he could enlighten us a bit on what the federal government has planned for West Coast shipyards.
Oh, he's talking about all the vast contracts to the East Coast, of course, for the corvettes and a few odds and ends to us in the West.
Jack, let me say that one of my efforts, Jack's efforts in recent months, has been to try to get us a fair share of shipbuilding contracts. You know, the LRT issue broke on the very day the final decision was made on shipbuilding in Ottawa. It was the most unhelpful act that anyone could have engaged in, to niggle about putting the word Canada on the LRT trains. Now, I don't think it affected the ultimate decision because we're getting some of the action, but not as much as we should have, Jack. But for our cabinet associates to say to us, interesting story yesterday. We saw how the government of British Columbia kept its promise about putting the word Canada on those darned cars. It wasn't helpful to us. It really was a most damaging action by the provincial government.
And you think we may have lost some of our shipyard millions because of that?
I don't think that was a factor, but it didn't help because we had a fight on our hands. The fight involving Quebec, the shipbuilders there, and the Maritimes and the West Coast, and why the Premier's office would choose that time to break a formal agreement that we had with them about the appropriate marking of LRT vehicles is beyond me. The issue isn't dead yet. May I reveal to you that the issue is not dead yet. We're planning further action, which in due time the provincial government will be apprised of. That's a news item for you.
In other words, you're not going to give them all the money until they carry out the logo deal.
Jack, I am simply making the statement that the issue is not dead as far as we're concerned.
How much money had the feds given to the LRT?
We put the money up front, but there are other ways to handle the situation.
You're going to get your logo on come hell or high water.
I am going to say, and I assure you that the issue is not dead, that we are planning further initiatives should the provincial government not comply with our original agreement. And some of your listeners may say, well, there's Ray again, he's quibbling about a small matter. Do you know, we came down to this. We were asked to provide the templates to be applied to the side of the cars, and they were going to spray gun them, and they phoned up to say, we're delighted, we have the templates, we're all set to go. And at the last minute, the Premier's office said, no, we're not going to do it. It's unbelievable.
Stupid.
And $60 million was contributed by the federal government, Jack. 75% of that money will be spent in Western Canada, most of it in British Columbia, contrary to some reports by provincial spokesmen who say, well, it's all Eastern anyway.
Have you committed yourself yet to the subsidy of, I believe it's several $100 million the provincial government wants for the gas pipeline to southern Vancouver Island?
That has not been fully concluded, that agreement.
How much money is involved in that?
Those who assume the federal government does not have some bargaining cards are quite mistaken.
Do you remember how much money is involved?
I think it's over $200 million, isn't it?
$200 million they want from you for the gas pipeline, but they wouldn't put the logos on the...
It's penny wise and pound foolish, to say the least.
Penny wise and billion dollar foolish. I think so. Go ahead, please.
But that is not a dead issue.
No, I see the club in the back in your hand right there, Mr. Perrault. The club is there. 500 million or 200 million?
I don't know what the final, no one knows what the final construction cost is.
But they want a substantial subsidy.
We said that we would provide the money necessary to help build the pipeline. And I think I heard a figure $200 million might be involved.
Go ahead, please.
This is on another subject. Senator Perrault, subject that's dear to Webster's heart. A few years ago, one of the senators came down with on a commission. He came down with the findings advising the government to abolish mandatory retirement. And I'm trying to, and Gordon Fairweather every year recommends that mandatory retirement be abolished. And Webster's coming up on 65 very shortly. And I was wondering if there's does the Bill of Human Rights as it stands now, or when it will in 3 years, will it make mandatory retirement an impossible thing? And
well, there are a number of initiatives in Ottawa to change that old concept that somehow you're all washed up at 65. There's some people who are extremely able at 95 and others who probably should be retired at 50. And we are now recognizing that, that talent is not necessarily age-related in the value to society. So Jack may be here for a while yet.
I thank you for these kind remarks. Remember that, you miserable caller. Talent is not necessarily
age-related.
Oh, I forget what he said.
Jack knows I'm one of the pilots who have fought it all the way to the Federal Court of Appeals.
Good for you.
I see you laughing on the monitor here.
No, you've got it's a serious issue, and you have a lot of friends in Ottawa.
I just showed my pharmacare card. See?
See? Well, you know what?
My thanks to Ray Perrault, who's certainly served his time, and I'll be back after the break. Oh, the Dean of Canadian Journalists will be here tomorrow. Put me in my place. His name is Charles Lynch. Old Charlie. A very good union story tomorrow involving both KMO and the steelworkers. Jess Suckamore will be here and Jack Hill of the steelworkers. Should be good fun. Haven't done much labour stuff lately. Eh? What are you talking about? Webster, 9 a.m. precisely. Ed Broadbent of the NDP on check at midnight. Musician Charles Lynch on Webster at 9 a.m. precisely. You know, it's sometimes the little nuances and innuendos that develop the best political stories. And by best, I don't mean the most important. I mean the most intriguing and in some ways the most humorous. You might remember a couple of months ago when Senator Ray Perrault was absolutely puce, P-U-C-E, puce with rage when the provincial government double-crossed them on the LRT cars and refused to put the federal government logo on the outside. You know, it was a bit chintzy. Anyway, I've got a good senator on this morning, and I want to know, just in passing, what he's going to do about it. And suddenly he brings out a club, a $200 million club, and says, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, we're not finished them yet, I'll teach them to treat me like that. And I think to myself, what could the club be? After all, the feds had given $60 million to the LRT, the Light Rapid Transit. But Perrault's got a $200 million club because the local people want that money for the Vancouver Island Southern Gas Pipeline. And it may well be that they will only get the $200 million if they put the federal logo on the Light Rapid Transit cars. Don't muck about with the federal government. They got more money to play with than the locals have. Just a sideline from Webster. I'll be back tomorrow, 9 a.m. precisely.